I am 5 pages in, and already Bella's negative, depressed attitude is bugging me. She's so whiny. I am literally 7 pages in, and am thinking every other quote, "You are so whiny." All right, more first impressions of our lovely princess of vampires, Bella, who I already despise. I'm not even 30 pages in. Everyone is horrible. The whole world is horrible. She's miserable and loves being a victim. Nothing is ever good enough. People that try to help her are being clingy or rude, or if they're ugly, they're automatically annoying. Being nice, apparently, is being overly helpful, and I feel like I'm going to roll my eyes out of my head. This vlog will be longer than I expected, but hopefully it will be entertaining. Hello, here is my debut video for my blog. Spoiler alert, some of you are already aware of my blog, with my Star Wars review for The Last Jedi, and also for my rant against Twilight haters. I hate Twilight too, so I can't really judge, but I'll get into that later. Welcome to my my new vlog. I have absolutely no idea what I'm doing, so I ask forgiveness in advance, because I have no clue. But I've had a lot of people ask me over the years what kind of books and movies and things that I like, so this isn't going to be like the typical YouTube channel. This is just going to strictly be, at least for the moment, media reviews, any kind of media, music, books, art, movies, and anything and everything in between, because I absolutely love it. So my first one, and I think I probably shot myself in the foot with this, is Twilight. Crap, what am I doing? I get this question constantly, so I will answer it again. Like these horrified reactions from people when they ask me, why the hell would you read this? Why would you put yourself through this torture? Never having read Twilight, this was quite frightening for me. Like, wow, this must be really bad. Long story short, and I will link it below, but there is a parody of Twilight called Awoken that mocks the young adult genre, specifically paranormal romance genre. There's a parody of a girl falling in love with, you guessed it, Cthulhu. You probably didn't guess it, but point being, it is still very strange. I have yet to read it. That will be another one of my videos on this thing, talking about Awoken, but I've heard it's fantastic. I really wanted to read this, and my friend, a very dear friend of mine, told me that if I wanted to really appreciate it, I should read Twilight. She gets on me all the time. She's like, I didn't force you to read it. Well, no. I have been judging this book and this series of books for years, so it was about time that I actually got off my duff and did something and actually read them. Because goodness knows we don't want to be the kind of people that judge a book without reading it. And you all know who I'm talking to. Quit judging me. I'll get into that later. I will have, just as a side note, I will have an actual blog typing up my specific quotations, my specific literary analysis of the books as I'm reading them. I'm currently in the middle of the third one, but I am planning on putting up individual blog posts for the books and the movies. This is what I did in college, is analyzing books and the themes and things like that. So it's something I love to do. I still love to do it. And I've always loved looking at how stories flow. Or not. I also wanted to try a vlog just because some of this you have to see to react properly. And there's so many things in Twilight that made me want to scream. So I'm going to share those screams with you because I can. Oh man, I'm going to start out with my rating instead of ending with it. So my rating for Twilight, the book, just the book, I would give it a 1.5 out of 5. So 1.5 out of 5. That is a very, very generous rating, let me tell you. My first impressions going into it were very basic. Obviously, there was the constant visceral hatred toward it from everybody. You can't go anywhere without running into this. I certainly did, by any number of people, just when they found out I was reading it. I hadn't even gotten to my opinion of it yet, and people were already telling me that I was horrible for reading this thing. All right, y'all are crazy. You need to chill. My first impressions were Bella is about as fascinating as Dola's dishwater, that Edward is creepy, that the story is just terrible, and that overall it was just a bad story. bad for vampire fans, bad for romance fans, bad for young adult fiction in general. I've had more than one person tell me that they literally burned their copies, and I will get into that later because I think that's ridiculous. So these were all my first impressions. Obviously, Twilight, whether or not you've read it, or seen it, is very easy to make fun of. The sparkly vampires, in my blog, I will put some of my favorite memes because they're just so fantastic. They're very, very, very easy to make fun of, but I wanted to see for myself. So it wasn't just in order to read the parody. It's been on my list for a while in the sense that I've been judging it for years. I've been one of those people that judges a book without reading it, and I didn't want to be that person anymore. That is so uninformed and ignorant and just kind of rude to the writer. Like, even if it's crappy, don't judge the work until you've read it. With my literary heart in hand, I picked up this book and started reading. Let me skip ahead about 150, 200 pages to where the story actually starts. I'm not kidding. It takes at least 150, if not 200 pages to get to the point. I swear, you have Bella's class schedule memorized by the time you get to the part where the plot actually happens. I'll summarize the plot just so we can get it over with. Bella moves to Forks of her own volition. She wants to move there because her mom drives her crazy. Her mom just remarried. Okay, fine. She spends at least 30 pages going into all the ways that Forks, Washington is different than Phoenix, Arizona. Thank you for that lovely editorializing, Stephanie Meyer. We know there's a difference between the two states. Bella won't shut up. She complains constantly. It is incessant about everything. Everything! She's so annoying! Oh my gosh! Oh, ugh. Okay, I'm good. Compose myself here. It was infuriating. I was not a happy camper at all. I was horrified. I'm like, this is what people were freaking out about. I hadn't even met Edward yet. I came into it kind of with a literary disadvantage in the fact that I knew everything that was going to happen. The first book especially, the first book and the last book are really, really well known. And so I went into this being like, well, lovely, like, what do I do? So I wasn't really surprised by anything, which kind of robbed the suspense for me. Not that you can really have suspense in this story, but you get my drift. And it was difficult to sludge my way through it. So she meets Edward. Edward is very distant and kind of jerky, even though from an outside perspective, I guess you could say he is, but she's really ultra sensitive to everything. We all know the summary. I'm doing a terrible job my first time around summarizing this. She meets Edward. Edward turns out to be a vampire. Well, I guess since this is spoiler alert, I am going to go into plot twists in this thing, in case you had any questions about that. Edward turns out to be a vampire. His family, which are other vampires that have kind of banded together, which is the only bearable part of this story for me. Honestly, you know, they're all vampires. Bella and Edward fall in love. They end up crossing paths 338 pages in. We finally have a conflict. 338 pages. Let me find the actual page here. I was so mad. I was literally texting people and being like, what the hell? We wait 340 pages for you to actually get to a plot and the book is almost over? Really? Really? You're gonna do this to us now? Impose. I got this. Okay. Ugh. She runs into a vampire. This rogue vampire who's not a vegetarian like the Cullens, wants Bella. Simply because he wants her. He wants to eat her. All that good stuff. The only shred of character quality I see in Bella is at the end when she willingly gives up her life for her mother, which was actually nice to see because she has virtually no character development at all the entire book until that point. So that was nice. And then Edward saves her. The family kills the vampire. The Cullens kill the evil vampire. This was the only redeemable part of Edward for me. Bella ends up getting bitten by this vampire. In this mythos, to become a vampire, the vampire has to bite you and the poison turns you into a vampire. In the book, it takes like 3 days of horrible, agonizing pain. In the movie, it's like a few minutes. Whatever. And oh man, on a side note, I cannot wait to review this movie. Oh man. Oh man. Anyway, back to focus. Edward sucks out the vampiric poison from Bella's bloodstream. Now the whole book, building up to this point, is that Edward is so driven mad by the smell of Bella's blood that you can't really tell if he loves her for her, or if he loves her for the smell of her blood. And you don't really know, and this was something that really bothered me too, you don't really know the whole book what their motivation is. Bella is obsessed with him. I mean, this is verging on pathologically, well, no, not verging on, full-blown pathological obsession with this man. The character I immediately thought of reading it was Anakin's obsession with Padme in episode 2 of Star Wars. And those of you who have seen it will know exactly what I'm talking about, because he is obsessed with Padme. Obsessed. Reading this whole thing, that's all I could think of was him. So finally, at the end of the book, we finally see, or at least I did, finally saw something that showed that Edward actually loves her. In order to keep her from turning into a vampire against her will, because he wants her to remain human, for whatever reason, because in this life, vampire life is so awful. I'll get into that in a minute. So he sucks out her blood, sucks out the poison in her blood, pardon me, and stops of his own volition, of his own strength, he is able to stop. That was very impressive to me. The one shred of quality from him the entire book was him being able to save her life without taking it. That's the whole point of the book, is that he's fighting this temptation and losing terribly. That is my very roundabout way of the summary, and that's how the book ends. He refuses to turn her. Like I said, it took about 300 pages for me to actually find interest. If I hadn't read this out loud and laughed hysterically, I wouldn't have gotten through this thing. This one was worthy of reading because of how bad it was. The prose was laughable. It was so choppy, and it was so mundane. It would overemphasize random things. She would be driving to school and she would randomly go off in a spout about describing the forest. Forest has nothing to do with the book. If she did this in the second one, in the following book, it would have made a lot more sense. But no, she describes it over and over and over again. So that was one of my biggest qualms, was reading it was difficult because she had virtually no rhythm. She had virtually no control of what she was saying. I'm a writer myself. When you read more and you write while you're reading, you can really get yourself into the writer's head, or you can try to. It read so much like a first draft. If I was editing, if I was given this by a friend or something and asked to edit it, I would literally take out the first 150 pages. Nothing happens. If I memorize Bella's schedule because there's nothing else of interest, there is a problem. That was my first big qualm. The prose, up until the end when there was actually some action, was terrible. It was just laughable. I mean, points of it were truly laughable. And I'll post some pictures on my blog post of certain quotes that were so bad. At one point, Bella says, "My heart spluttered hyperactively." No, I'm not kidding. She actually says this. It was difficult getting into the story even beyond the prose. So we have the prose, which was terrible. So bad. Okay, fine. I committed to reading this book. I've committed now. I'm not going to let this thing beat me. I'll try my best not to let this thing beat me. I get through the prose and finally get to some interesting stuff when Edward starts speaking to her. Oh man. Oh man. One of the things that was just absolutely insane. Or, well, not insane, more like maddening. It drove me crazy. Bella never ceases to, every time Edward does anything. I mean, he could be lifting his hand off of his leg to put it on his desk. He could be blinking. She calls him beautiful and gorgeous. The Adonis-like Greek god statue standing in the sunlight while the sunlight reflects like a million crystal diamonds. Ugh. Every time she describes him, she brings up how good looking he is. On one level, that pissed me off because I'm so sick of young adult novels describing these heroes in the story as having only good physical attributes. She goes into virtually nothing about his personality, other than what you can glean from what he says to her, which for the majority of the book is contradictory. He is constantly going back and forth over what he wants to do, if he wants to stay with her, if he wants to just throw caution to the wind, which is what he does the majority of the time. He isn't even sure himself if he can control himself. So you have that. I lost count. I didn't even try and keep count of how many times Bella would describe every time he spoke or moved or did anything, how beautiful he was. Please, just stop. I wanted to rip my hair out. You pick a character who is more like a demigod than a vampire. That's fine. Do what you want. It's a young adult novel, it's a wish fulfillment novel, what have you. And I'm going to link a couple of reviews that I think are fantastic. One is Totally Mocking, which I love dearly, by Sailor J, and I love her. Another is by a gal named Lindsay, who also does a review talking about the fact that Twilight really isn't that bad as a whole. And I'll get into that later. So it's a wish fulfillment novel, like, okay, fine. But you don't have to overemphasize it every single time Edward does anything. It is anything. I swear she would describe him as beautiful if he were passing gas, if he still had the ability to pass gas. I'm sorry, that was mean. Point being, that drove me absolutely crazy. And so you have like the ups and downs, even the way that she finds out that he's a vampire. The movie was terrible. I know I'm not reviewing the movie right now, but it was so bad. In the book, it was relatively organic. Relatively. When she finds out from an old wives' tale from Jacob, as he is coined by other reviewers, the ethnic third wheel. Poor Jacob tells her the story of the Quileute werewolves and the cold ones, the vampires. That's how she figures out, and she goes to Google. Like she goes to Google for her vampire researching needs. Okay, fine, I can live with that. They talk about it, the melodramatic, you should stay away from me. No, I won't stay away from you, I love you. They have had one full conversation when Bella declares to herself that she loves him. One conversation. I am partial to the stories of love at first sight, fairy tales, getting married after you've just met, when they're in the right context. And I know I'm going to get a lot of people that are going to flip over that comment, but it's true, I love them. Because in those stories, it's a different kind of timeline than it would be in like our life, in our reality, and how our world functions. But with this, she is supposedly in real life. That's the whole point of this book. She meets a mythical creature, and this book is supposedly going into how that would function. But she doesn't. She doesn't go in anything that's even relatively realistic to how it would actually happen for a vampire. It would not be this easy to be a vampire if we stuck to the actual vampire mythos, which she doesn't at all. It bothered me on so many levels of what this was saying to young women. And this is really what I wanted to get into with this review, because I know this is like going all over the place. More than anything, what I disliked about this one specifically was how quickly she became obsessed with him. I wasn't convinced. The entire first book, I was not convinced that Bella actually loved Edward. Now, I will say she is obsessed with him. He is her Adonis, and she describes him that way. She is her idol, her god, with a lower G, or uppercase, depending on how much you want to trash Bella. If I had to pick one of the biggest things that bothered me about how their relationship formed so quickly was not the fact of the timeline, it was the fact that they had no knowledge of each other. He admitted to her and to himself that his attraction to her was almost entirely due to him wanting to drink her blood, but yet she has no reason, or she thinks she has no reason, to not be in love with him. He even tells her that everything about him is meant to lure a victim. His smell, his looks, his strength, his agility, like all of these things, which makes sense to me, but she never once questions if her motivation for loving him is altered at all by that. She loves it. She loves being his prey. I'm surprised it took as long as it did to the end of the book for her to ask him to turn her into a vampire. I expected it a lot sooner. That was one of my biggest issues with it, was that their relationship wasn't founded on anything. I don't have a problem with stories where the characters fall in love really fast. I don't. They don't bother me if they're done well. This was not done well. I looked at it, I checked it. They had one conversation, and she's in love with him. This isn't like puppy love. This is, I want to die for you. I am obsessed with you. Take me away from everything. That was my biggest issue with this book. As far as the vampire things go, I just thought it was kind of stupid. My friends and I agree it would have been easier, or it would have made more sense and been more enjoyable if they were just a race of demigods or fairies or some sort of otherworldly creature instead of a vampire. But vampires have that level of seduction to them. They're foreign at this, and they're exciting, and they're very sexual. There's a lot of hidden meaning behind all of that. I haven't read Dracula yet, but that's on my list. Those of you who have read Dracula have told me this. I've been told that there's a lot of those kind of themes in vampire lore. The whole book, I kept asking my friend who'd read it before me, why is this such a big deal for Bella to turn into a vampire? Why is this such an issue? She replied, well, other than being on a liquid diet, there's really no downsides. That was just annoying to me. I'm not a horror aficionado. Up until now, I haven't even really been interested in vampire lore. I knew it was there, but it wasn't any kind of big deal. but I love the potential behind actual vampire stories. The only reason, at the end of all of this, the only reason I would even give this a 1.5 out of 5 and not a 1 is the plot twist at the end was compared to the rest of the book, I thought well done, where James lures her. Like, we finally have conflict, we finally have action, yes, this is good. Even I was surprised. And I mean, granted, I'm not the kind of reader that tries to guess what's gonna happen, because I didn't know what happened at the very end of Twilight, ironically. I knew everything else except I didn't know about James. That is what bumped it up from a 1 for me. 1.5 on days when I'm feeling more generous, I'd give it a 2. That's being very, very, very generous. For those of you who haven't read it and are judging me for it, get off your high horse and actually read it before you slander me online, please. Because y'all are driving me crazy. More than anything, the implications it has for how women should address relationships is what bothered me most about it. Edward, in the further books, shows himself to be more of a layered character than I expected. Definitely more layered than in this book. If you haven't read it, it's good to read to see what not to do. I know that's the typical bad book response, but it's true. I will say this, I would never say a book is worth being burned, not even this one, not even 50 Shades of Grey. We are not Nazis. We are not censoring communists. We are intelligent, mature adults. We should be able to read a book we don't like without mocking or critiquing or ravaging other people for reading it. And I'm not just talking about myself. I know other people who really like Twilight. At the end of it all, I think if you haven't read it, it's worth reading once, in the sense of you can see why people like it. Why girls who are told their whole life they're nothing, they're plain, no guy will like them, someone comes in mysterious and tragic and with a dark, brooding past and sweeps them off their feet. There is an appeal in that because of how difficult it is, especially now, to get into a committed relationship that doesn't suck you dry. This isn't just for adults, this is for teenage girls too. They feel it just as much as we do. At the end of the day, I will buy copies of these books just to have them, but I like having books that are terrible as examples. I will be reviewing the Twilight movie next. Oh man, stick around for that one because it's going to be hilarious. I have so many critiques of that film. It makes the book look amazing, and the book was terrible. Join me next time for Bella and Edward's continuing adventures in the movie adaptation, and I will see you then.